In this segment, we're going to be covering the New Testament, or the New Covenant, you might say. And I'm sort of amazed that the Gospels were really ever written. Let me explain why. The earliest church thought that Jesus was coming in their lifetime. The great parousia, the great return of Jesus, was going to happen certainly before the year 100. So if Jesus were returning so soon, why in the world do you need history? And for that reason, I think it's amazing that they had the foresight, nevertheless, to take up the pen and to record this greatest life ever lived in the Gospels as we know them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you open a Bible and come to the 27 books of the New Testament, the first book, of course, is the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And one would think that this is the first of the writings in the New Testament, but it's not. The epistles of St. Paul were the earliest writings in the New Testament. In fact, either Galatians or 1 Thessalonians were probably the first verses that we find in the Bible written down by this greatest apostle, Paul of Tarsus, who was the greatest missionary in church history. He was the first to give a theology of Jesus' own teaching. Jesus wrote nothing that has survived. He left it to his disciples to record it all, and Paul was one of the greatest.
And so what Paul obviously does in his letters, he addresses them. He has an addressee, someone he's sending it to, and writes the body of the letter, and then has some greetings at the end, often, greeting other people and sending greetings from various people. This would have been rolled up. It would have been on a scroll, probably papyrus. Would have been rolled up, had a seal placed on it, placed in a tube, much like we have these tubes for mailing things today, and probably hand-delivered by a personal messenger. They didn't have a postal system or a UPS or anything like this, so probably hand-delivered and perhaps even read by Paul's delegate to the congregation, say in Galatia or in Corinth. So the process of writing would have looked very common. What's more important is what happened after it was received by those who took the writing. So when Galatia, say, received Paul's letter, and it actually solved the problem in Galatia, or Corinth received the letter and it solved the problem in Corinth, they realized that this was worth hanging on to, in a sense. The letter to the Romans, whatever church, this was worth hanging on to, and passed around then to other churches. In fact, Paul tells specifically, for example, in the letter to the Colossians, that they should have this letter passed on to the church in Laodicea. So there's a sharing of the letters from the very beginning, and they're being used because they're, effective, because the Spirit does His work through His Apostle Paul.
Later, the Gospels are going to be written, probably before the fall of Jerusalem, before even the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64. And there's more and more scholarship showing, as we tried to point out in the desert, that the Gospels were written down earlier rather than later. The critics, of course, try to say they were written as late as humanly possible to deny their eyewitness testimony. And they failed pretty miserably in the process, let me tell you. Current scholarship is that they were probably written, at least the synoptic Gospels. That means looking at Jesus' life from the same general vantage point. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written probably before, as I say, the fall of Jerusalem. So this is virtually eyewitness reporting.
Luke, for example, tells us very specifically that he's writing a diegesis, a Greek word diegesis. It's essentially a historical narrative, and he's writing this down for Theophilus, who's probably his patron, who's supporting him in his work, and writes a book out so that he might be certain of the things that he had been taught, he tells us in Luke chapter 1.
Now, after the epistles, then come the Gospels written down, and the letters that the other apostles wrote to the church. St. Peter, for example, wrote one or two of them. James, the half-brother or relative of Jesus, big debate over what he should be called, but he was the first bishop of the Christian church. He wrote his famous epistle. And then, of course, we have the writings, probably the last two, admitted to the canon. Remember, again, the canon is the standard or rule of belief, which books are included in the New Covenant, in the New Testament, which aren't. The last two to be included were 2 Peter and the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, of course, had quite a difficult time because it is written in a special form called apocalyptic, which is highly symbolic, very difficult to translate, and for that reason causes a lot of problems in translation and application to the present day yet, with so many people misunderstanding the symbolism in the book of Revelation and then trying to use it as a chart for what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Wrong way to use the book of Revelation. As a matter of fact, the Synod and Council of Laodicea in 364 did not include the book of Revelation in the New Testament canon, and neither did Pope Gregory the Great in the West. So there was always some question as to whether or not it was canonical.
Canon is just a word that, well, this again comes from Greek. Canon is a measuring stick. Eventually came to mean a rule, something you measure something with. And so the canon is that which is authoritative, that which you use to measure or evaluate other things. So with the scriptures, we evaluate other teachings, other writings. So it's canonical, it's authoritative, is what that term means.
The question of canonicity, of course, occurs to the present day yet. How do we know what is God's Word and what isn't? There were several rules for determining what should be in the canon and what should not. One rule was, of course, it had to be by an eyewitness. The account had to be written by an eyewitness or a near eyewitness. Luke, for example, was not one of the 12 apostles, but he was very close to them and had eyewitness reporting, of course, in his trips with St. Paul. So that would be an example of a near eyewitness. Then we have, of course, the second rule, and that is it must be coherent with the rest of Christian doctrine. It can't be way off the deep end somewhere. It has to be integrate very well with the rest of Christian theology. And the third rule has got to be what was used in church worship. And in the Greek-speaking churches in the East and in the Latin-speaking churches in the West, they always decided what was being read. Perhaps on the Sunday after Easter, they all reported about doubting Thomas. And so that becomes then part of the canon and part of the pericopes as well, the readings for the church year. And for that reason, we have a pretty firm grasp of what the canon looked like long before the Emperor Constantine. There are so many put-downs nowadays, like that book of misinformation, the Da Vinci Code, by Dan Brown, which says that Constantine engineered the canon. He did no such thing. As a matter of fact, the canon was not even discussed at the Council of Nicaea in 325.
But there's, again, pretty good evidence kind of working back from people like Justin Martyr, who's in Rome in 160, from Irenaeus, who's in Lyon, France in 180, that they're referring to an already existing collection of the four Gospels. And they're referring to it in ways as if it's been around for a long time. They use phrases like, it's been handed down to us, you know, that it didn't just happen yesterday, and I didn't decide on this. But it's, they don't know exactly how it happened, but they know that it's been there for some time. And so most scholars will acknowledge that by 125 to probably 150, you have the formation of the four gospel codex. Codex is a Greek word for book, folded pages. And what's rather interesting is the four gospel codex, the four gospel book. If you make a book physically, pages out of papyrus, the largest you could make it is about identical to the size of the four Gospels. That is, you can't add to it, or you can't fit anything more in it, sort of interestingly. And what we have in the manuscripts that we have today that have been found archaeologically are always and only those four Gospels. So you never have a codex, a book that has, say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then Gospel of Judas. It's just never copied with the canonical Gospels. It's always and only these four from the earliest attestations, and never varies. On the other hand, writings like the Gnostic Gospels that we talked about earlier, Judas or Thomas or Philip, they never are found alongside canonical texts, whether they're Old or New Testament. They're always just with Gnostic materials. So again, how that happened, who decided that, we just don't know. What we do know is that the church, by the middle of the 2nd century, had the 4 Gospels and the 13 Pauline letters. And if you want to say it, their canon was set.
We do have a list of those books that were included early on in the canon of the New Testament through the writings of the church historian Eusebius. In very interesting places, he lists the books that were included, and it was always the core of the canon, including the 4 Gospels, the book of Acts, and the whole, what's called the Pauline corpus, that is the body of all the writings of St. Paul and Peter and James. That was the core. Then later on, other books were added, the Johannine letters, and 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, they're called, and finally, the book of Revelation.
So the other writings of what eventually we call now the New Testament were sort of used by some, but not by everybody. Whereas the Gospels, Paul's letters, you'll have theologians and pastors from England, France, Egypt, Asia Minor, North Africa, Italy, all citing the Gospels and Paul's letters. But Hebrews, they really didn't know about it in Rome or France. James, they didn't know about in the West. So some writings were locally used, some were universally used. By the 4th century, the church is now in a situation where it's beginning to make contact with each other in a more formal way. So you have, of course, Constantine becomes emperor. You have the Council of Nicaea, where they're striving for unity in confession of Christ and the Nicene Creed. And it seems to be about the same time that manuscripts are now collecting all the books together. So you start to have bigger books with 4 Gospels, Paul's letters, and then the rest of the writings. They can do this in the 4th century, partly technologically. Now they switched from using papyrus to using parchment, which you can make much thinner, much larger, and you can actually put these all together in one book. So it's sort of like they went from floppy drives to hard drives, and now they have to sort of make these decisions. What do you put in the book? So it's partly because of the church environment, partly because of technology, that you start to have the finalization of the New Testament canon. Contrary to what's popularly portrayed in writings like Da Vinci Code or various TV shows, you never have a church council saying these are in, these are out. It just doesn't happen. They use in the councils the writings that were already acknowledged. So the Council of Nicaea, they're using the Gospels, they're using Paul's letters. They don't have to vote on it, it's already there. So to say that the church sort of decided to kick some books out and keep some in is very anachronistic. It's simply not what happened. Yeah, there's a little bit of debate about things like James or a writing like the letter of Barnabas, which we don't have in our New Testament. Some churches used it. It's sort of harmless, I mean, it's not the best book, but it's not terrible. But eventually it didn't make it into the New Testament. It's not the end of the world. What's always been there, however, was Paul's letters and the 4 Gospels. And we still really work this way today. You'll notice that most sermons you hear will be on the 4 Gospels, Paul's letters. Those are still really the central books of the Christian faith.
So we have scriptures that are so very reliable. We tried again to point out in our discussion in the desert how very wonderful it was to have these aids, and more are being discovered, by the way, every day, meaning, therefore, that we're able to get a better and more accurate version of the autographs. We don't have them, that is, the ones that were actually written by the apostles, but we have a better idea as to what the original wording was like when we compare more and more, through good textual criticism, what the original writings must have been. So I cannot thank God enough that He has provided this incredible amount of scholarship to make sure that the Bible that we have today is more and more accurate in terms of the ancient manuscripts. Now, one, of course, can never do better than the glorious majesty of the King James Bible in 1611. But there's no question that there are some mistranslations in it because of the Old English and because they did not have access to good early manuscripts. In fact, the King James Bible was based only on 6 major manuscript traditions. But the Revised Version of the Bible in 1870, there were already 2,000 Greek manuscripts from which they could draw. And as I told you earlier, today there are 5,700 and more, perhaps soon 5,800. So it's really a paradox. The farther removed we're getting from the earliest writings, the more accurate they're becoming, because we have more and more ways of correlating through the various languages as well and seeing what was actually written by the prophets and the apostles. Coming up next, my friend Joel Lamp is going to take us on a fascinating excursion into the history of the English Bible.